Once upon a time, in a small village in Nigeria, there lived a kind and happy girl named Adah. Adah was 9 years old and loved to play in the sunny fields near her home, chasing butterflies and singing songs that her mother had taught her. Adah lived with her father, Mr. Cheek, a tall man who always wore a big smile, and her stepmother, Mrs. Ngozi, who was as gentle as the morning breeze. Don't forget to like the video by subscribing to our channel. Let us know your favorite part of the story in the comments. Mrs. Ngozi treated Adah like her own daughter, baking her favorite yam cakes every Sunday and helping her with her homework. Adah liked Mrs. Ngozi very much, but she always wondered why she looked a bit like the pictures of her own mother, who had gone to heaven when she was very little. One sunny afternoon, Adah helped Mrs. Ngozi water the plants in her small garden. Mrs. Ngozi was humming a familiar tune, one that Adah's mother had sung to her when she was a baby. Adah was curious. "Mama Ngozi, how do you know this song?" "My mom used to sing it to me," Adah asked, looking confused. Mrs. Ngozi smiled softly, a twinkle in her eyes. "It's a very special song, my dear. Many mothers here in our village sing it to their little ones." Adah nodded, but her little heart was full of questions. She remembered that her father's eyes sometimes looked sad when he watched them together. There was a secret, she felt, but she didn't know what it was. Every night, Adah would sit under the big mango tree and look at the stars. She felt connected to her mother through the twinkling lights. Little did she know that Mrs. Ngozi was watching her from the window, a mixture of joy and sadness in her heart. One day, the village chief announced a big festival to celebrate the harvest. Everyone was excited, and Adah was eager to dance and play with her friends. As Mrs. Ngozi prepared Adah's dress for the festival, she found an old, small box hidden in the closet. It was dusty and had a faded ribbon on it. "What is this?" Adah asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Mrs. Ngozi hesitated, then said, "It's a little box of memories, my dear. Maybe after the festival we can sit down, and I'll show you what's inside." Adah nodded, her mind whirling with excitement and wonder at what secrets the box might hold. The day of the festival was approaching, and with it, perhaps, the answers to her family's mysteries. As the festival approached, Adah couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen, something that would change her life forever. The day of the festival arrived with the sun shining brightly and the village buzzing with excitement. Colorful decorations hung from the trees, and the sound of drums filled the air. Adah was wearing a beautiful dress of bright Ankara fabric that Mrs. Ngozi had finished sewing the night before. Her face lit up with a bright smile as she joined the other children in the dance circle. Meanwhile, Mr. Cheek and Mrs. Ngozi stood on the sidelines of the festivities, watching Adah with a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. They exchanged glances, knowing that today would be a turning point in the life of their little family. As the dancing slowed and the evening settled, Adah returned to her parents, her cheeks flushed with joy. Mr. Cheek knelt down and hugged her tightly, whispering, "You danced beautifully, Adah." "Thank you, Daddy," she chirped, then turned to Mrs. Ngozi with a curious twinkle in her eye. "Mama Ngozi, can we look in the memory box now?" Mrs. Ngozi exchanged a quick, nervous glance with Mr. Cheek, then nodded. "Yes, my dear, it's time." They walked back to their house, the village festivities continuing behind them. Inside, Mrs. Ngozi took the dusty box from the shelf and placed it on the table. Adah watched eagerly as her stepmother carefully untied the ribbon and opened the lid. Inside were several small items: a faded photograph, a tiny soft baby blanket, and a small hand-carved wooden toy. Adah grabbed the photograph first. It was of a young woman holding a baby. The woman had gentle eyes and a warm smile that seemed strangely familiar. "Who is this, Mama Ngozi?" Adah asked, looking up. "This is your mother, Adah," Mrs. Ngozi replied, her voice trembling slightly. Adah looked at the photo and then at Mrs. Ngozi. "But why do you have it?" Mrs. Ngozi took a deep breath. "Because, my dear Adah, There is something about your family that you don't know yet." Just then, Mr. Chaik came over and put his hand on Mrs. Ngozi's shoulder. He nodded at her and gave her a reassuring look. Mrs. Ngozi gently took Adah's hand. "This story, your story, is special," she began, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Outside, the drums continued to beat, and the laughter of the village children floated in through the open window. Adah could feel her heart beating fast, ready to hear the truth about her past. Mrs. Ngozi began to speak of the past, weaving a tale of love, loss, and long-kept secrets. "Many years ago," Mrs. Ngozi began, "your mother and I were best friends. We grew up together in this very village, sharing every joy and every sorrow. When your mother met your father, I was as happy as if I had found love myself. They were a perfect match, and soon you were born, bringing even more joy into their lives." Adah listened intently, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Ngozi's face, trying to catch every emotion that crossed it. "Your mother was the kindest soul," Mrs. Ngozi continued, her voice soft but clear. "But my dear, life can sometimes be very unpredictable. When you were just a baby, your mother became very ill. It was a difficult time, and she worried a lot about what would happen to you when she could no longer be with you." Adah's eyes widened, and she felt a lump in her throat. She squeezed Mrs. Ngozi's hand, urging her to continue. Before she died, your mother asked me a very important question," Mrs. Ngozi said, pausing to steady her voice. "She asked if I would take care of you if anything happened to her. She trusted me more than anyone in the world, and she wanted me to be your stepmother." Adah's heart was heavy, but also full of love. She had never known that her stepmother had such a deep connection with her own mother. Adah looked at the photograph again, her eyes tracing the contours of her mother's face, now seeing the resemblance between her and Mrs. Ngozi, not only in their features, but in the warmth of their smiles. "And you've kept this secret all this time?" Adah asked, her voice a mixture of wonder and confusion. Mrs. Ngozi nodded. "We thought we would wait until you were old enough to understand. Today seemed to be the right time. I hope you can forgive us for not telling you sooner." Tears welled in Mrs. Ngozi's eyes as she hugged Adah tightly. "I love you too, my dear, more than you will ever know." As they sat together, the sounds of the feast outside seemed to celebrate not only the harvest, but the new understanding between Adah and her family. Mr. Chaik joined them, wrapping his arms around both of them, completing the family circle. Just then, a knock at the door interrupted their moment. Mr. Chaik opened it, and Adah saw a familiar face from the village. Mr. Chaik opened the door to reveal Mr. Okonkwo, an old friend of the family and the village storyteller. He carried with him an air of mystery and wisdom, as he often did, especially during festival times. "Ah, I see I have come at a special moment," Mr. Okonkwo said, his eyes twinkling as he looked at Adah and Mrs. Ngozi sitting close together. "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all, Mr. Okonkwo. Please come in," Mr. Chaik greeted him warmly. Mr. Okonkwo came in carrying a small, intricately carved box. "I brought this for Adah," he said, handing her the box. "It contains something your mother wanted you to have when you were old enough to understand her love and her hopes for you." Adah opened the box carefully and found a small, beautiful locket inside. It was gold and shiny, with her mother's initials engraved on the outside. Inside was a tiny photo of her mother, and on the other side was a photo of a much younger Mrs. Ngozi with her. Adah felt a warm wave of love and connection. Mr. Okonkwo sat with them and told stories about Adah's mother, filling the evening with laughter and a few tears. As the night wore on, the sense of family and love in the room was palpable. When Mr. Okonkwo left, Adah hugged her stepmother and father tightly. "I think I get it now," she said. "I feel like I have two mothers watching over me." "That's right, my dear," Mrs. Ngozi said, kissing her forehead. "You always will." As Adah went to bed that night, the lessons of the day settled in her heart. She understood that family isn't just about who shares your blood, but who shares your life's journey with love and sacrifice. The next day, Adah shared her new understanding with her friends, telling them the story of her two mothers. They listened, spellbound by the tale of love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Moral of the story. The moral of the story is that true love is not bound by blood, but forged through understanding, compassion, and a willingness to embrace each other's lives. Family is where love lives, memories are made, and laughter never ends. Always cherish those who care for you, for they are your true family. It's a great story. I hope you enjoyed it, dear viewer. Don't forget to leave your thoughts on the story in the comments. You can like the video by subscribing to the channel. See you soon.